Today I'm joined by Bec Valley, a nurse educator with Queensland Health, and someone who I would describe as a local vaccine advocate. Hi, Bec.
Hi.
Welcome to AVAX 101.
Great, thanks for having me.
Before we start, I just thought we'd get into a little bit about your educational background and your work background. How long have you been a nurse?
Yeah, so I graduated from QUT as a registered nurse 11 years ago. At that time, I moved into a graduate position with Queensland Health, which was a very rewarding job. And I stayed there for a couple of years in that same position, so general medical surgical nursing. At that point, I then I had quite a progressive plan in what I wanted to do in my nursing career. So I started working towards those goals. So I did a postgraduate diploma in international health and development around 6 or 7 years ago, and started to move into a position that was more looking at case management of some of our really unwell, people in our community and those with very complex comorbidities and illnesses and that sort of stuff. I then moved into more of an education role, so looking at how do we actually train people? How do we ensure that our professional development is up to standard? How do we ensure our nurses are safe practitioners and that they're providing the best clinical patient-centred care to our community? And then just recently I have finished my Masters in Public Health. That was only this year through UQ. And my position at the moment is slightly different. So in the last sort of month or so, I've just stepped into a completely different role that's looking at project management and how can we develop policies around safe and secure nursing in the virtual world, so digital health.
So you've really moved through the ranks.
I really have moved through, yes, definitely. I've done all the way from clinical right through now to perhaps a more managerial academic kind of nursing career approach, which is really why I love the nursing world. It's very, very broad in what you can do and your opportunities.
So in thinking back to your education and all your experience, what was the thing that really first interested you in moving into healthcare as a profession and being a nurse?
Yeah, a couple of things. One would be I really did want a career that was versatile. I have a passion for the academic, but I also have a passion for people and doing something that's practical. And so it really was one of the only careers that stood out to me as, I could potentially travel, I could work in a range of different, obviously settings. I could also pursue an academic career if I wanted to, but at the same time, I was actually providing a practical service to the community, which to me was really important for a purpose. Like I wanted to be able to live a life that was, I'm doing something to help people. And so they were my two biggest things. And I feel like very satisfied that I've done both those things, even in just a very short career compared to many other wonderful nurses out there. And that's where I'll continue to go in those two directions.
So that's your educational and your professional side. But in terms of your personal side and how do vaccines fit into your own life story and your own experiences?
Interesting. Again, I would say in a couple of ways. The first way would be how it would fit in, I think, to anybody's story. Obviously, I'm vaccinated to keep myself safe when I was a child and a baby. My own daughter is, of course, vaccinated. She's 18 months, so she's up to date with all her vaccines. So I'm very pleased that she's able to be kept safe from these diseases that are out there and present. In my professional life, of course, vaccines are, if you want to work in a range of different areas, you want to work with kids, you want to go and work on a ward, you're going to have to be vaccinated to protect the community and those who are most vulnerable. But probably more interestingly, in my personal life, vaccines have a really interesting place. So I had a kidney transplant going on 15 years ago now. And of course, when you've had a kidney transplant, maybe not everybody knows this, but you're very immunocompromised as a result of any organ transplantation. So you take anti-rejection immunosuppressant medications that literally suppress your immune system down to the very bare minimum that's required to survive. And that is so that your immune system is unable to mount a response and reject whatever organ it is that you've had transplanted. So naturally connecting that to vaccines, I had my transplant when I was 17. And as a result, from that time onwards, I can't get any vaccines from that perspective. There's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, you're not going to really get the same response as a normal healthy immune system. So essentially it's pointless. You're putting something in your body that is just not going to do anything. And secondly, it can be potentially dangerous if it's a live vaccine, again, because the body hasn't got the ability to fight that off. And so, in theory, you could get quite sick from it. So for both those reasons, you don't really get vaccines once you're had an organ transplant or immunocompromised. And so as a result, I'm very passionate about other people getting their vaccinations and other children. And so I care a lot about the community being, up to date with their vaccines, because essentially my life depends on it. When you look at something more recent like COVID, my life genuinely depends on it. I appreciate that in Australia we don't have necessarily high rates of some of these communicable vaccine preventable diseases, but we still have a lot of them. They're still in the community. And taking it for granted that they're not out there is not a situation I'm in. It is, I'm aware that they're there. And so the more people who are vaccinated, the better I am protected, and my family and my husband and my own child, so that I can live a long life and not die of something that essentially is very preventable.
So in your life, as a nurse, you've been on the front lines of healthcare.
Yep.
And in your own personal life, you're in a situation where if other people don't get vaccinated, your life could actually be at risk.
Yeah, definitely.
And so that tells the story that even if people don't feel as though they're at risk, they need to be vaccinated to protect other people.
Definitely. I would say for the age category that I'm in, most of my friends, they're not at a particularly high risk of dying from COVID, probably. They're not at a particularly high risk of contracting or dying of other diseases which are in the community, like measles and things like that. But those who are vulnerable are. And when you're a young adult, you tend to really only think of other young adults, and you go, oh, it's okay, I'm not going to get very sick. And if I did, I would just stay at home. Well, actually, there are a lot more people who are vulnerable and immunocompromised than just the elderly, which is unfortunately the stereotype people have is, oh, well, it's only going to be the elderly that are affected. Infants, there are babies, there are cancer patients, there are people like me who are, 30-year-old organ recipients, and there's 20-year-olds and 15-year-olds, and there's loads of young people who have a whole life ahead of them who are, for whatever reason, unable to get vaccinated, and who would really pay with their life if they contracted some of these diseases. And so you're doing them a service. You're protecting the most vulnerable in your community by being vaccinated, and we call that herd immunity. And there's a very large population of us that are very dependent on that.
So in many ways, it's such a simple thing that other people can do to protect the lives of so many others.
Yep, definitely. It's one of the key reasons, realistically, a healthy person should get vaccinated. We're not really vaccinating you potentially because we think you're going to die of some of these diseases. You probably have the immune system to fight some of them off. But firstly, that's not a guarantee. There are many young people who we know that die from these vaccine-preventable diseases. You only need to look into those countries that don't have the same privilege as we do of high rates of vaccine. And secondly, those who would be unable to get a vaccine would really, really pay with their life. Like, you just can't emphasise that enough.
So I know that you are a bit of a local advocate for vaccines in your own community and with the people that you know around you. I was wondering, what are some of the biggest concerns that other people have raised about vaccines to you?
Yeah, I would say at the moment there's a bit of a divide in what people are voicing concerns about. One category over here would be children and infants and those traditional vaccines that we're all very familiar with for many years. And another is now, of course, the COVID vaccine that's been coming out and obviously the hype around that. And so I think for both, one of the major things is what is in vaccines. So most of my parenting friends, of course, ask the question, and non-parenting friends, what am I putting into my body and what am I putting into my child's body? And so they want to know, what are these ingredients? And unfortunately, they do hear what I believe is misinformation about how these ingredients work and, the dosages and the volumes of how much we're putting into the body and, things like that. So there's a lot of I would say unreliable sources out there about what's inside a vaccine and what are we putting in our bodies. So they've got big questions around that. They obviously are wanting to protect themselves and their children. The next big question would be, what are the long-term consequences of a vaccine? Unfortunately, there is still a lot of false information regarding autism and, will my child develop some sort of cognitive decline or some sort of serious illness like epilepsy is, at the moment a concern that people are having about vaccines. And essentially there's really no evidence for any of those things, and yet parents are very concerned about that. So they're the big ones that I get regarding when we're discussing vaccines and some of their concerns. The one with COVID is probably more, again, maybe ingredients and those sorts of things as well, but really that one, everyone is concerned about the safety and the speed of those trials that they've gone through. And so it's very important that if you are advocating for vaccines, you actually have the facts behind that there at no point has been any steps in these safety measures have been missed. They have all been followed very appropriately. It's just that they've been followed faster than what they normally would, and they've been funded very quickly, given that there's a pandemic. And so when people hear some of those, even just basic facts, very quickly their fears are quite alleviated. But when their main source is social media or conversations or, even just blogs and things that they're reading, unfortunately, that really does get into your head, especially when it's your family's safety that you're feeling is the concern. So they're the big ones that I feel people voice to me a lot.
And it's interesting because while we don't have scientific evidence for significant adverse effects from vaccines, we do have hundreds of years of evidence of what vaccine-preventable diseases
of the benefits
cause and the benefits of the vaccines themselves.
Absolutely.
So you referred a little bit to how you've responded to some of these concerns, but what have you found that works best when you're interacting with people with vaccine hesitancies?
Well, interestingly, when you just said we have overwhelming evidence to what these diseases will do if you let them run rampant. And so one of the key things I generally discuss and people generally ask about is, well, what would happen if my child got measles anyway? Or what would happen really if, I got COVID, And so when I'm able to give them, well, actually, here are some of the complications that you and your child could very easily face. You have no guarantee that you won't be the victim of some of these life-altering, if not at times death, from these illnesses. And that surprisingly is very effective in chatting to them, because often, of course, in our minds, things that we vaccinate against in Australia, we don't know what they do. We really don't know what measles and mumps and rubella looks like anymore at all. And really, unless you've been to some of these developing nations, you don't have an appreciation for just how deadly and dangerous and awful these diseases are. So that's always one thing. There's let's chat about that. And that's normally very moving for parents. Well, actually, I definitely don't want my child to have those problems and complications. So that's one thing. Another thing that I find effective is explaining some of the science around what does it mean when these ingredients are in a vaccine, but what does it mean when there's a tiny, 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 tiny amount? So explaining the difference between a toxic dose of something and actually this is just part of the constitution to keep it safe while we transport it and it's not in a fridge. It's a drop compared to a bucket. Yeah, a bucket is going to be a problem, but you're not getting a bucket injected, you're getting a tiny drop and your body is very able to cope with that. And talking through things like some of these ingredients your body produces naturally.
Exactly.
And many people have no idea that actually we make this stuff a lot of the time. And so that alleviates fears. So it's things that actually are scientific and evidence-based, but making it in a way that's actually, this is understandable for me as a general layman who's just worried about my kids' safety. So definitely looking at what are the complications if I don't vaccinate, chatting to them about ingredients and some of the science behind it. What is it? How does it work? Dosages, stuff like that. Another thing I find that really works is talking about herd immunity and my own story. Obviously, most of my friends do know my story and know who I am, but at the same time, they do forget and they're like, oh, well, we're young, so it'll be okay. And so sometimes I will prompt and be like, well, actually, for me, I'm really dependent on this herd immunity and other people getting it. So just this idea of protecting the vulnerable. And most people have a grandparent or an unwell parent or family member who's had cancer who isn't 80, who is 60 or 50 or 40, and they go, oh, actually, this is relevant to me in my life, and really laying that foundation of this isn't just something that the government wants you to do, this is something that is for you and your safety and your benefit. And I think lastly, really listening to their concerns. That is important, that people feel heard, so that you're not just combating them with, oh, actually you're wrong, but going, actually you're right, those ingredients could be a worry, let's talk about that. And people are generally like, oh, I'm really glad I had this conversation, instead of becoming dogmatic about something.
Well, I'll say that everything you've mentioned is actually advice that is given for improving vaccine advocacy.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're doing things well, and you're in a situation where you're actually telling a personal story, which is very powerful.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about ingredients is we get things like formaldehyde, which sound very frightening, and it's actually part of normal metabolic functions in a cell.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of the key sort of examples of that. Now, in terms of your personal advocacy and in your local community and the people that you interact with, I know a story about you where you had a baby shower, and when you sent out invitations on the baby shower, it said something to the effect of, if you're not vaccinated, please don't come.
Yes, that's right.
How did that go down?
That went down, surprisingly well. I have a few friends who I know choose not to vaccinate. And so I sent out a notification basically to publicly, completely, I put it on social media, I physically handed it out as you said, and basically it said, we're really excited to meet our baby. If you're not vaccinated, you're going to have to wait until she's vaccinated so that she's protected. And people were generally very supportive. And then I did have a couple of friends who very kindly just said, I'll see you in 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks when she's vaccinated and had time to mount a response to those vaccinations and, being kept safe. And they were respectful of that and they sort of stayed away for that period of time. So it went quite well. It's interesting that we're even in an era where we have to do that. I think like when I told my mum I was doing that, she was like, oh, is that even a concern? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. People can come and hold your baby and all those sorts of things when they themselves are not vaccinated, and I don't know their exposure. I can't see where they've been, what they've done. And now with COVID, if I was to have a second child, I would go 10 times harder on, unless you've had this vaccine, you're really not safe to be around a very vulnerable little person who, unfortunately, babies die of vaccine-preventable diseases like whooping cough frequently, and it's a tragedy. These are preventable illnesses. These deaths do not need to happen, and so I did what I could to stop that.
Yeah, and Australia has one of the strongest health infrastructures in the world.
Yeah,
has had notable cases of infants dying from pertussis.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a very serious concern, and I think we are at a really crucial time in our health history, if you like, because we're moving into an era where anti-vax is really becoming more and more increasingly a trend that people are on board, and that potentially can be dangerous. And I encourage people to look into the facts and to talk to the people who perhaps have access to the resources and the information that is reliable, and even developing your understanding on, well, what is a good piece of evidence? How do I actually know if something is right and reliable? Because we often are flicking through social media and we get little bits of information, and those bits of information come from somewhere, and 9 times out of 10 it's going to be someone's opinion and not what actually the evidence tells us, the science tells us. This is what works, this is what happens if we repeat it 50,000 times. We need to know actually this is the real stuff, this is the facts and the truth around what's in it and why it's important to have it. And otherwise we're looking into an era where these vaccine preventable illnesses will come back, and they'll be life-threatening for many more people than your grandparents. They're going to be life-threatening to myself, my own child, anyone who's pregnant, anyone who's fighting any sort of illness where their immune system might even be just a small level of compromise. Even if you just have a cough or a cold or a flu, your immune system doesn't work the same way as it does when you're healthy. So if you're exposed to these things in the community at that time, you could pay with your life. And so it's important that we advocate for this change to people to keep being on board vaccination.
I'm just going to ask one more question that comes off of what you just said.
Yeah.
You mentioned this idea of looking to credible sources and looking to the actual facts. When you have people coming to you and say, look, I might have seen this post online about vaccines being unsafe, how do you tell people that a source is not factual? Or how can people be sure that what they're looking at is actually from a credible, authentic source?
Yeah, so I'm very much an academic at heart, and so I generally will send people in a direction where, one, I can see where the sources come from. So I want to see the references, and I want to see, I don't necessarily follow the references, and the person doesn't need to do that either, but when I'm chatting to them, I might say, hey, is there anywhere where it says where that came from? Whether it's at the bottom, whether it's at the end of the link, whatever it might be, is there somewhere that says, see here for what you can click on? Is it a journal article? Is it a book? Who wrote it? When did they write it? All that sort of stuff. And most of the time, these blogs and of course social media, of course there's no reference. There's nothing there where they can follow the trail of where does this come from. And so normally I would tell them to, one, follow government websites. The government websites are, for the layman, a very reliable place to start because everything's there if you want to follow it up. If you're not sure what this paragraph meant, they will have a reference that says, this is where this came from. And you can go and you can type it into Google and you can pull up the journal article and you can have a read. And then you can go, okay, I know that's the science. This is how it works. You might not read the whole journal article, but I encourage them, go to somewhere where they're accountable for the information that they're delivering. Other reliable sources are generally universities. And then if my friends are really like, oh, look, I want to be able to look some of this stuff up myself, one, I would generally send them information that I know is a reliable source. But two, I'll always say to them as a pointer, just begin with a database. Google Scholar. We may laugh at it, but if you're not an academic and you haven't got access to databases, please start there. Yeah. Go onto Google Scholar, and I tell them, put the right years in. You don't want science from 1995. Put the right years in and type in your concerns. See what it says. See what it brings up. And you don't have to read the whole article, read a bunch of abstracts. Just get your head around that information that is reliable and scientific should be in a bunch of research and should be published and should be accessible for people to read. And the government does a great job of condensing it, as do universities in the courses like you've produced. They condense it and put it into a nice package for you. But if you want to see it for yourself and you don't know where to go to Google Scholar. That's what I would tell people. Be
a bit of a source detective.
Yeah, exactly.
And the interesting thing is academics, researchers, we actually do that. When we are investigating a topic, we actually start skimming through abstracts.
Yeah.
We start looking for data in abstracts and then we go from there.
Yep.
So that's really good advice.
Yeah, it's really, the whole what is good research is kind of lost even in my own generation really. We have access to such quick information that we've really lost the art of, well, where does this information come from? And that's the big question. Where is it coming from? Right. And so if it's coming from someone's opinion, that's fine, but let's look that up. Let's look up the science of that opinion. And we would have the same approach for many things. You're not going to drive a car unless you know the science behind the car. This is how it works, this is how an engine works. You're not going to jump in a vehicle where someone says, I think this is how it works, I think this is how we put it together, and then end up crashing. It's important that we have the same approach to everything we do in life. It shouldn't just be, things out there like, sending my child to school and getting into a vehicle. It should be vaccines. It should be, what I'm reading, how I'm gathering my information and making my life decisions.
And going to the right sources, as I've said before, you don't necessarily go to a police officer for financial advice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And it's the same thing with vaccines and medical decision making. Let's go to the sources that are in that business.
Yeah, the experts.
Let's go to the experts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Thank you very much for joining us today on
You're
AVEX
welcome.
101 Beck. We really appreciate your time, and I think everyone's going to get a lot out of what you had to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.